Rose stood in front of the mirror, her eyes lost in the reflection of a woman who no longer recognized herself. The plan she had devised, to fake a pregnancy with Ricardo Montenegro to ensure a comfortable future, had been a lie that was now consuming her. Ricardo's unexpected death left her alone with her farce and, with it, the imminent arrival of Felipe Montenegro, Ricardo's brother. She knew the time to face the consequences was approaching, and she couldn't prepare herself for what was to come. The sound of a knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Rose sighed and, with a slow movement, walked to the entrance. When the door opened, she came face to face with Felipe Montenegro. He was as imposing as his brother, but there was something different about him. There was no such easy smile as Ricardo. Felipe stood there with an immense seriousness, his eyes observing her without any warm expression. "Rose," he said, his voice firm and controlled, "we need to talk about what happened. Ricardo made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would take care of you and the child. Now that he is no longer with us, I need to keep that promise." Rose felt a weight in her stomach. She wasn't prepared to deal with this, nor with Felipe. He seemed so different from Ricardo, and the fact that he was there, ready to fulfill an obligation and not of his own free will, made her uncomfortable. But there was no choice. She no longer had any way to escape the lie she had created. "Will you marry me?" The question came out more nervous than she expected. She knew Felipe had no personal interest in marrying her. He was only there because of his brother's promise. Felipe did not hesitate, but the way he spoke was distant, almost impersonal. "Yes, that is what I must do," he replied. "I am here to fulfill my brother's promise. The marriage is a formality to ensure the child's future." The silence between them was heavy, and Rose didn't know what to say. She felt that Felipe was distant, as if he were just following protocol, not seeing her as anything more than a responsibility to be fulfilled. Felipe turned to leave, without goodbyes or further explanation. "The formality of the marriage will be resolved soon. Let's not waste time on this." Rose stood there alone, standing in the same place. The weight of the situation was crushing her. The marriage she had forced with the lie about her pregnancy would not work with him. She needed to deal with the situation, but how? And, more importantly, how could she hide the truth for so long? The wedding day arrived sooner than Rose had imagined. She found herself, once again, in front of a mirror, adjusting the white dress that, on an ideal day, should symbolize happiness. But to her, that dress was just another symbol of her lie. The image reflected did not look like the woman she had expected to be, she looked like a stranger, dressed for an engagement she had not chosen. The ceremony was short and emotionless. The chapel of a luxurious hotel was the stage for their farce. Only the lawyers and a few staff members were present. Felipe, standing at the altar, seemed as impassive as ever. He had not shown a single sign of affection or discomfort. Rose, on the other hand, tried to hide her anxiety. The vows they exchanged were neither personal nor romantic. Just formal words, spoken almost mechanically. Where is the happiness in a wedding day? Rose thought as she watched the papers being signed. Felipe handed her the engagement ring without saying a word, and Rose, without looking him in the eye, placed the ring on his finger, more out of obligation than for any other reason. When the priest declared that they were married, the feeling of relief was almost imperceptible, as if she had just accomplished a necessary task, but without any genuine joy. At the end of the ceremony, when the final words were said and silence fell, Felipe was the first to move. "Come on," he said directly, still emotionless on his face. "We need to go." Rose didn't know how to respond. The only thing he knew was that marriage was nothing more than a formality to him. Nothing more. But what came next worried her even more. They were married now, but where would that take them? The drive to the Montenegro mansion was silent. The elegant car cut through the city streets while tension hung in the air. Felipe sat behind the wheel, focused, but completely oblivious to Rose's presence at his side. She felt immense discomfort, but also physical and emotional exhaustion. The lie was starting to become unbearable, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep it up. When they arrived at the mansion, a large iron gate opened automatically, revealing the imposing building that stood on top of a hill. Rose stood still for a moment, taking in the grandeur of the place. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, and it certainly wasn't the life she wanted to live. But at that moment, what mattered was that the commitment was sealed, and now she would have to live with it. Felipe led her to the front door, where a butler greeted her with a polite but distant expression. "Mr. Montenegro, Miss Rose," the butler said solemnly. "Welcome to your new residence." Rose felt the weight of those words. Her new residence. She had left a simple apartment, but now she was in a palace, with everything she could want in terms of comfort. But something much more important was missing: freedom. As the servants escorted her into the mansion, Rose tried to get used to the luxurious surroundings. But everything seemed cold and impersonal. The house was impeccably decorated, with expensive furniture and expensive paintings on the walls, but none of it made her feel at home. She missed the simplicity, the normality that she had left behind. Felipe led her down a long hallway to a large bedroom with a four-poster bed and classic furniture. "This will be your room," he said, without any emotional involvement. "I will be in the next room. We will have no interaction beyond what is necessary." Rose looked at him, a little taken aback by the coldness of the situation. They had gotten married, but he barely looked at her. She knew that, to him, she was nothing more than a responsibility, a promise he was keeping. Felipe was not interested in her, and it seemed that he saw her more as an obligation than as a wife. "Understood," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. She knew she couldn't expect anything more from him. Felipe watched her for a moment, as if waiting for a reaction. But without saying anything else, he turned and left the room, leaving her alone. Rose walked over to the window and looked out over the mansion's garden. Below, the city lights shone in the distance, and she could see people moving about on the streets. But in this mansion, perched on the hilltop, she felt isolated. The walls of the house seemed to close in around her. She sat on the bed, still in her wedding dress, and allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. The weight of the situation was starting to get to her, and she didn't know how to deal with it. What would she do now? How could she continue living here, next to a man who didn't even consider her as a wife? Minutes passed, but Rose didn't move. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she barely noticed the soft knock on the door. When she heard Felipe's voice, she stood up quickly, trying to hide her fragility. "Rose," he said, his tone lower and more serious than before. "I would like to talk for a moment." She opened the door and found him in the hallway, his eyes dark and serious. "About what?" she asked, trying to hide the nervousness in her voice. Felipe hesitated for a moment. "I want you to know that this isn't personal. I know you're only here because of my brother's promise. And I want you to understand that my commitment to you is only out of obligation. I don't expect us to become close, and I hope you don't get your hopes up either." Rose nodded, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. She had known that, but hearing it from Felipe, out loud, was different. It was as if he was trying to make it clear that there was no room for her here, other than a formal responsibility. "I understand," she replied with a slight nod. Felipe looked at her for a moment, as if he was still deciding something, but then he sighed and turned away. "Have a good rest, Rose." And so he walked away, returning to the next room, leaving her alone once again. Rose leaned against the door after closing it, staring into space. Night had already fallen, and the distant sound of the mansion seemed like a deep echo in her chest. She was alone in that great palace, and loneliness seemed to take over everything. She knew this was just the beginning of a new life, a life without love, without connection, and full of lies. And worst of all, she didn't know how long she could sustain it. After their silent breakfast, Rose and Felipe decided to take a stroll around the property. The mansion's garden was vast, with stone paths lined with towering trees and vibrant flowers. The soft morning light touched the fresh grass, creating an almost magical atmosphere around them. However, even with the beauty of the place, the silence between the two was still palpable. They walked side by side, without rushing, but also without saying many words. Felipe seemed distant, as always, lost in his own thoughts, while Rose tried to find something to say, something to break the tension in the air. "Have you always lived here?" she asked, finally deciding to start a conversation. Felipe glanced at her before answering, as if he was pondering his words. "Yes, the mansion has been my home for many years. My family built it, so I've always been here." Rose nodded, sensing that he didn't want to talk too much about the history of the house. But the answer seemed satisfactory enough. She was more interested in knowing something more personal about him, something that would make him more human. "I've never lived in a place so big. The house is so imposing, so different." She tried to smile, to break the ice, but there was still a certain tension in the air. Felipe looked at her, a little more attentive now. "It's not for everyone. The loneliness, the distance. Everything is too big, too silent." Rose felt that his words had something sincere, something that made her realize that, perhaps, behind the facade of a cold businessman, there was something more. They both continued walking until they reached a small lake in the middle of the garden, where the sound of water was soothing. It was then that, without warning, the sound of the sprinkler suddenly turning on caught them by surprise. "Ah!" Rose exclaimed, quickly pulling away, but it was too late. The jet of water hit them both squarely. She tried to move further away, but the water began to soak her quickly. Felipe was also hit, and they both started laughing, trying to dodge the water jets. "Looks like we're out of luck today," Felipe said with a mischievous smile, trying to dodge yet another jet. Rose laughed, but soon tripped over a tree root, losing her balance. When she saw that she was going to fall, she closed her eyes, waiting for the impact to hit the ground, but it was then that she felt Felipe's strong arms around her waist, holding her firmly. "Careful," he said, his voice deepening, as he pulled her closer, preventing her from falling. Rose stood still for a moment, feeling his body so close to hers. Their hearts were beating faster, and she could feel his breath against her face. He was so close that she could hear the soft sound of his breathing, and the warmth of his body seemed to envelop her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Rose looked at him, her cheeks turning slightly pink. "Yes. I think so," she replied, trying to control the anxiety that arose from his proximity. Felipe kept his hand firmly on her waist for a moment, and his eyes fixed on hers, as if he was assessing the situation. He seemed to be reflecting, before softening his expression and moving away slightly. "You are very beautiful," he said unexpectedly, his voice lower, as if the words came out on impulse. Rose didn't know what to say. That sentence wasn't something she expected to hear from Felipe, especially considering the reason they were married. But something in his words made her feel a small sigh in her chest. "Thank you," she said, a little awkwardly, trying to put space between them to cool the sudden tension. Felipe, without another word, stepped back and looked around, as if returning to his usual posture of detachment. I think we should go back inside," he said matter-of-factly. "We're wet." Rose nodded, trying to hide the discomfort of their closeness that still hung in the air. They began walking back to the house, this time in silence, but with a sense of something new emerging between them, a slight shift, a kind of silent understanding. The night was quiet and serene. The mansion, with its wide corridors, seemed to envelop Rose in a peace she could not reach. She had gone to bed early, but something was bothering her. She still thought about Felipe, how he treated her with respect, but there was a distance between them that she did not know how to bridge. Still restless, Rose got up. She was feeling thirsty, and she didn't want to wake anyone up to ask for something. She decided to go down to the kitchen alone. The house was silent, with the soft light of the lamps creating a cozy atmosphere. As she went down the stairs, she heard a low sound coming from the kitchen. Who could it be, she thought, curious, but she never imagined that she would find who she found. When he reached the door, he saw Felipe, sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was alone, his shoulders relaxed, but his expression seemed distant, thoughtful. Rose hesitated, but when she saw that he was there alone, she decided to go ahead. Upon noticing her presence, Felipe looked up and smiled slightly, a smile that seemed inviting. "Are you awake, Rose?" he asked, his voice a little deeper than usual, a sign that the drink had already taken effect. "Yes," she replied, with a shy smile. "I was thirsty and I didn't want to bother anyone." Felipe gestured with his hand, indicating for her to sit down. "You're not bothering me. Make yourself at home. I was just thinking for a while." Rose walked over and sat in a nearby chair, but kept her distance. The situation was awkward, and she didn't want to seem inconvenient. Felipe, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. "I didn't know you drank," Rose commented, trying to break the ice. Felipe gave a low laugh. "The life of a businessman. Sometimes, drinking is the only company we have." Rose felt a pang of compassion. "I see. But don't worry. I'm not an alcoholic," he said, as if to reassure her. "I was just trying to relax a little." Felipe gave a short smile. "I like simple things sometimes. I don't always allow myself to, but the night gave me that freedom." Rose watched him for a moment, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The tension in the air was palpable. Something was different, and she didn't know exactly what, but something in her had changed too. He seemed more approachable, more human. "Are you okay?" she asked, a little more curious than she realized. Felipe looked at her more intensely. "I am. Sometimes I just need a moment alone to process everything." She didn't know what to say, but she felt that somehow she was beginning to understand a little more about him. They were silent for a few minutes, until he spoke again. "Are you okay, Rose? How are you dealing with all this?" He seemed genuinely interested. She hesitated, but decided to be honest, even though she didn't know if he would understand. "It's been hard. I haven't gotten used to it yet, to all of this. To his death, the marriage, to our situation." Felipe nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "I understand. It's not easy. But I'm here if you need anything. You don't have to go through all of this alone." The tone of his voice was sincere, and it made Rose feel a little more at ease. She hadn't expected him to be so empathetic. The tension in the room seemed to ease, and she felt like something was breaking between them. They chatted for a while longer, about trivial matters, until the conversation began to change direction. Felipe placed the glass of whiskey on the table with a slow movement. "Can I touch your belly?" Rose froze. The unexpected request took her by surprise. She didn't know what to say. What did he want with that gesture? And the worst part, she knew that the pregnancy was a lie. She didn't know how Felipe would react if he found out the truth. She looked at him, trying to gauge his reaction, and then answered in a low voice, I don't know. I'm not used to this." Felipe, however, didn't seem bothered by her hesitation. He lifted his hand gently, as if asking for permission, and when she didn't object, he placed his palm gently on her belly. The gesture was gentle, almost affectionate, and Rose felt strangely comfortable with it, despite her mind screaming that it was all fake. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his gaze intent. She took a deep breath. "Yes, it is. I'm just not used to being treated like this." Felipe pulled away a little, but didn't remove his hand. "Don't worry. I just want to make sure you're okay." She didn't know how to respond. The words wouldn't come out of her mouth, and their proximity, that unexpected touch, made her uneasy. Then, suddenly, he stepped closer. The pressure in the air between them grew more intense. Felipe looked at her with an expression that Rose couldn't decipher, but there was something there that made her heart beat faster. Without saying a word, Felipe leaned forward, and his lips touched hers, in a soft kiss, but full of a tension she hadn't known existed between them. The kiss was short, but loaded with something more. Rose felt a shiver run down her spine, but before she could process everything that was happening, Felipe pulled away slightly, still watching her with his eyes downcast. "I'm sorry," he whispered, almost as if he regretted it. "I don't know what came over me." Felipe stood up quickly, moving away from Rose. "I shouldn't have. It was a mistake. I'm sorry." Felipe, with an embarrassed face, picked up the glass of whiskey again, bringing it to his lips. "I need to go to my room. I don't want to do any more stupid things." He left the kitchen without saying anything else, leaving Rose alone, her heart beating wildly and her mind full of doubts about what had happened and what would come next. Felipe entered the room and closed the door tightly, leaning his back against it. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that was overwhelming him. What had he done? He ran a hand over his face, frustrated with himself. He shouldn't have kissed Rose. He couldn't. She was his brother's widow. It didn't matter that she had never actually married him. To Felipe, the mere fact that she was pregnant with Leonardo's child made everything wrong. He went to the bar in his room and filled another glass with whiskey, but hesitated before taking it to his mouth. Drinking wouldn't solve anything. With a heavy sigh, he poured the liquid into the sink and rested his hands on the counter, looking at his own reflection in the mirror in front of him. His eyes were dark, confused. Rose. She was unsettling him. He had agreed to marry her out of honor, out of loyalty to his brother, but now things were spiraling out of control. He hadn't expected to feel this way. The memory of her touch, the soft taste of her lips, made his body react. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to erase the sensation, but it was impossible. "Damn it, Felipe. What are you getting yourself into?" He walked over to the bed and sat on the edge, his elbows resting on his knees. His mind was spinning in conflict. He wasn't an impulsive man, he always made rational decisions, but around Rose, something in him seemed to go astray. Had she felt that too? Or had it just been a moment of weakness on his part? And, worse, how would he continue living under the same roof as her, knowing that he wanted her in a way he shouldn't? Felipe ran his hands through his hair, exhausted. Sleep would not come easy that night. Felipe threw himself against the back of the bed, letting out a heavy sigh. That marriage was already a challenge in itself, but now everything seemed even more complicated. That he closed his eyes and tried to push away what he was feeling. He tried to convince himself that the kiss meant nothing. That it was just a moment of weakness, caused by alcohol and forced coexistence. But it was a lie. He knew. From the moment he met Rose, something inside him had changed. At first, it was just a sense of responsibility. Then came admiration. Now it was something he didn't want to name. The worst part of it all was that he had no idea how she felt. Rose had been speechless when he kissed her. She hadn't pushed him away, but she hadn't responded completely either. And then, he apologized and left in a hurry, without giving her time to say anything. Felipe ran his hand over his face. This can't happen again. He needed to stand his ground. Keep his distance. They were married, but only on paper. There was no room for feelings there. But deep down, he knew he was fooling himself. Because every time he looked at Rose, every time she smiled or he caught a whiff of her perfume in the hallway, the fight inside him became harder to overcome. Rose walked into the room and closed the door slowly, her heart still racing. She leaned against the cool wood, bringing her fingers to her lips. Felipe kissed her. She didn't know what to think. She didn't know how to react. She could still feel his heat, the closeness of their bodies, the way he looked at her before he hurriedly pulled away. He apologized, but that kiss didn't feel like a mistake. At least, not to her. But how could I feel that? That wasn't the plan. She shouldn't have gotten involved. Her goal had always been money, security. She faked her pregnancy to ensure a comfortable future. She didn't expect Ricardo to die. And much less that she would end up married to his brother. Felipe was different. He was serious, honorable. The complete opposite of Ricardo, who always pampered her and accepted whatever she said. Felipe was not like that. He observed, suspected, asked questions. And now, on top of everything, he kissed her. Rose stepped away from the door and paced the room, restless. She needed to think of a way out. She couldn't keep up this lie forever. But how could she confess? What would happen when Felipe found out she was never pregnant? He would hate her. And, worse, she was starting to care about it. Rose sat on the edge of the bed, her heart clenching. She couldn't go on like this for much longer. But she didn't know how to stop either. Because, despite all the lies, she didn't want to leave Felipe. And that terrified her. The next morning, Rose woke up early, still confused from the events of the previous night. She felt uneasy, as if she were treading on dangerous ground. The best thing he could do was avoid Felipe and try to keep things under control. He went down to breakfast before he woke up, eating quickly and leaving for the city right away. He needed some time to think, away from the mansion and, especially, away from Felipe. He, in turn, woke up shortly after and, when he went downstairs, found the table already empty. The maid informed him that Rose had left early, and he felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Great, he muttered to himself. The day would be busy at the company, which was exactly what I needed. Work. Focus. No distractions. Felipe spent the morning sorting out contracts, meetings and conferences. He didn't give his mind any space to wander, immersing himself in work. But even so, every now and then, Rose's face would pop into his mind. The worst part was that he didn't know how to deal with it. The kiss from the night before still haunted him. He had never been an impulsive man, he always thought before he acted. So why was it any different with Rose? He ran his hand through his hair and let out a sigh. I need to control myself. And to do that, I needed to keep my distance. Resolutely, he turned his attention back to the documents in front of him, determined to occupy his mind with something productive. But no matter how hard he tried, a part of him already knew the truth, avoiding Rose wouldn't be as easy as he thought. The night fell cold, and the rain beat down outside the mansion. The wind whistled in the windows, and the sound of thunder echoed across the dark sky. Rose was curled up in bed, her body tense, her eyes narrowed. Since she was a child, she was terrified of storms. The noise of thunder, the flash of lightning, everything made her panic. She tried to calm herself, hugging her knees, but she couldn't stop the silent tears that ran down her face. The fear was suffocating. On the other side of the house, Felipe was lying on the couch in his room, watching a movie without paying much attention. The tiring day at work had helped keep his mind occupied, but now, alone and in the silence, his thoughts returned to Rose. The sound of thunder grew louder, and he got up to make some tea. But as he stepped out into the hall, he heard a muffled sound. He paused for a moment, frowning. Then he heard it again. It was crying. Without hesitation, he went to Rose's room and knocked on the door. Rose? No answer, just soft crying. He turned the doorknob and walked in. She was on the floor, huddled against the wall, shaking. What are you doing there? He asked, kneeling down beside her. Rose looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I'm scared, he whispered, his voice shaking. Felipe felt his chest tighten. Without thinking much, he took her hand and helped her get up. "Come to my room. You can barely hear the wind there." She hesitated for a second, but when she heard a loud thunder, she held his hand tighter and followed him. In Felipe's room, the atmosphere was more welcoming. He pointed to the bed. "You can lie down here. I'll stay on the couch." Rose lay down, trying to calm herself, but with each flash of lightning her body trembled. She curled up tighter, pulling the blanket up to her face. Felipe watched for a moment, sighed, and then walked to the bed. "Come here." She looked at him, surprised. "What? You're shaking." "I'll stay here with you." He lay down next to her and, without hesitation, pulled her into his arms. Rose couldn't resist. Feeling the warmth of his body calmed her in a way nothing else could. "You don't need to be afraid," Felipe whispered, running his hand through his hair. She snuggled closer, closing her eyes, feeling his scent, his touch. Her heart was still racing, but no longer from fear of the storm. Rose lifted her face and met his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Felipe felt his body react to the proximity. Her lips were so close. Without thinking, he slid his fingers down her face, his gaze fixed on hers. "I feel like kissing you," he confessed, almost without realizing he was saying it out loud. She didn't move away. Felipe couldn't resist. His mouth found hers, in a kiss that started slowly, but soon became more intense. Her body molded to his, the desire growing between them. But then he suddenly pulled away, breathing heavily. "I can't do this," he murmured, looking at her with conflict in his eyes. "You're carrying my brother's child in your belly." Rose looked at him in silence, her heart racing. But instead of answering, she kissed him again. And at that moment, all of Felipe's doubts and resistance were forgotten. He pulled her closer, and together they gave in to the desire they could no longer deny. Felipe slid his fingers over Rose's soft skin, tracing delicate paths as if he wanted to memorize every detail. His touch was firm, but at the same time careful, awakening sensations in her that she had never experienced before. The heat of his body against hers made her heart race. Each caress was like a flame that was ignited, making her body react involuntarily. He explored her skin with a devotion that made her sigh, as if he were discovering a precious secret. Felipe's lips traced a slow path down Rose's neck, sending shivers down her spine as he pulled her even closer. The touch of his hands glided gently, exploring her with desire. The world outside became silent, only their rapid breathing filled the room, mixed with the sound of the heavy rain falling outside. When their eyes met again, there was something beyond desire. A connection that went beyond the physical, something they both didn't yet fully understand, but couldn't ignore. And then, with no more barriers between them, they gave themselves over to the intensity of that moment, as if nothing else mattered other than what they were feeling for each other. Rose woke up before Felipe. The soft morning light filled the room, and she lay there, watching him as he slept peacefully. His face looked peaceful, more peaceful than she felt. Her eyes traveled over the contours of his face, every line, every expression, and a feeling of pain tightened her chest. She knew what he had done for her. He had married her because of a lie, because of a pregnancy that didn't exist. Everything he had done up until that point, every gesture, every word, had been for the wrong reason. He had married her, not out of love, but out of a commitment of honor to his brother. He believed in her, he trusted her, and she felt increasingly guilty about it. She couldn't go on living like this anymore. She couldn't keep being this lie in her life. She was in love with Felipe, more than she ever imagined possible, but she knew he deserved the truth. He didn't deserve to be trapped by a lie. He didn't deserve to be with her, with a son who didn't exist, living a life she had forged to gain his trust. With a heavy sigh, she got out of bed, careful not to wake him. Her heart was heavy, but her decision had been made. She couldn't stay any longer. In the silence of the room, she packed her bags, carefully folding her clothes, trying not to make any noise. Each piece of clothing felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the lie she was carrying was transmitted to each item she packed into the suitcase. Rose sat down at her desk and picked up a sheet of paper. The ink from her pen slowly dripped as she wrote, feeling each word tear at her soul. It was a simple letter, but it was filled with emotion. Felipe, I can't bear to live with this lie any longer. You did everything for me, you married me to honor your brother's memory, and I betrayed you from the beginning. The pregnancy you believed was a sham. I am not worthy of your kindness, nor of your love. I love you, Felipe. More than I could ever say. But I can't keep lying to you anymore. I apologize, but I need to get out of your life. I'll send you the divorce papers to sign. It's best for both of us. With love, Rose. She read the letter one last time, feeling the lump in her throat tighten even more. With her bags packed and the letter carefully folded, she took one last look at the room, which had been the scene of her best and worst moments. Without making a sound, Rose left the room and went to the living room, where she picked up the keys to the mansion. Her heart felt heavy in her chest, but she knew she was doing the right thing. It was too late to go back, and she couldn't allow Felipe to suffer any more because of her. She hailed a taxi, which showed up at the door minutes later. She climbed into the car, her bags beside her, and asked the driver to take her far away, to someplace where she could start her life over without any more lies. The taxi drove off, and Rose looked out the window, watching Felipe's mansion disappear as the car drove down the streets. It was there, at that moment, that she felt true pain. Not for leaving the lie behind, but for leaving Felipe, the man she loved, without knowing that he was losing a part of herself. The farewell was not only physical, but also emotional. And Rose knew that, perhaps, it was the hardest of all. Felipe woke up early, still with Rose's scent on his body, but something seemed strange. He couldn't explain it, but something in the air was different. He got out of bed and felt the weight of a doubt bothering him, a feeling that things weren't as he thought. The memory of the previous night was still fresh in his mind, and the kiss he had shared with Rose, despite being something overwhelming, left him divided. He pushed his thoughts away for a moment and went to the bathroom, trying to shake off that feeling of confusion. He undressed and stepped into the shower, but not even the hot water was able to calm his mind. After a quick shower, he went downstairs for breakfast. The house was too quiet, and he saw no sign of Rose. In the kitchen, the housekeeper informed him that she had not seen his wife since breakfast. Philip felt a chill, something was wrong. He tried to convince himself that she must be in the room or in the house, but the feeling of emptiness bothered him more and more. Without thinking twice, he went up to Rose's room. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. He stood in front of the door, hesitating for a moment, until something urged him to enter. When he turned the doorknob and stepped into the empty room, the silence enveloped him in an unsettling way. The room was tidy, but there was no sign of Rose. She wasn't there, and that made him even more anxious. He took a few steps across the room, his gaze settling on a note on the bedside table. Felipe's hand shook slightly as he picked up the piece of paper, the writing clear and simple. What he read next left him speechless. Felipe, I can't stand living with this lie anymore. You did everything for me, you married me because of something that doesn't exist, and I betrayed you from the beginning. The pregnancy isn't real, it never was. I'm not worthy of your kindness, nor your love. I love you, Felipe. More than I could ever say. But I can't keep lying to you. I'm going to file for divorce and send you the papers to sign. I know you deserve more than me. With love, Rose. Felipe read and reread the letter in his hands, the weight of the words falling like a bomb on his chest. The lie he had believed to be true from the beginning had been undone there, in those simple words. He couldn't process everything that was happening. Pain and relief mixed together inside him. The feeling of betrayal was strong, but at the same time, he felt a strange relief in knowing that the pregnancy he believed was not real. But how should he react? How should he deal with this? He had gotten married because of a lie, but what he felt for Rose was real, and that confused him even more. Felipe looked around, hoping that somehow she would appear, but the room was empty. The house was too silent, and her absence left him with an inexplicable feeling of loss. Felipe felt heavy-hearted as he walked through the empty house. The letter Rose had left had shaken everything he believed in. He tried to rationalize, to convince himself that she had done the right thing by leaving, but a part of him couldn't understand. How could she just disappear like that, without even explaining everything in person? He was lost in thought as he picked up his cell phone and tried to call her. The phone rang several times, but the call would not go through. With each failed attempt, his anguish grew. He felt a mixture of anger and worry. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? That feeling of helplessness was consuming him. Not knowing what else to do, he decided to go to her old apartment. When he arrived, he saw a "For Rent" sign on the door. His chest tightened even more. He knocked on the door, even though he knew no one would answer. The neighbors said that the apartment had been rented to someone else a few days ago. Felipe stood there for a moment, staring at the building, as if waiting for something to change, as if Rose could come back and explain everything. But nothing happened. He sat on the sidewalk, his mind full of doubts and frustrations. How could he have believed her? How could she just leave without warning, after everything he had done for her? He tried to convince himself that she was right, that the lie couldn't continue and that maybe it really was the best thing for both of them. But the pain of knowing that she had walked away without explanation made him question everything. He tried to think rationally, as he always did in business, but he couldn't. It was the right thing to do, he thought. She needed freedom, space, and I can't force a woman to be by my side if she doesn't want to be. But words weren't enough to erase the emptiness he felt. The love, that confusing and overwhelming feeling, was still there. He knew she loved him, but he also knew that deep down, he had become a lie in her life. Felipe stood up and, with a deep sigh, walked away from the building. He had nowhere else to go, but he knew he had to move forward, even if his heart didn't know how. It was hard. It was best for both of them, he told himself, but something inside him didn't believe it. He still wanted her. But she, in turn, seemed to want to pull away. With his thoughts clouded and his heart heavy, Felipe returned to the mansion, feeling that a part of him had disappeared along with Rose. Here's the continuation with Felipe trying to understand the situation and looking for Rose, but finding only emptiness. He starts trying to convince himself that it was the best for both of them, but he's still deeply affected by her departure. A few days passed and the pain of Rose's departure still weighed on Felipe. He tried to distract himself with work and company commitments, but nothing seemed to take his mind off everything that had happened. At that moment he was informed of the arrival of a lawyer at the mansion. The man was bringing the divorce papers, and Felipe, without even looking at them, made a closed expression. "I'm not signing this," he said firmly. "Before anything else, I want to talk to her. I won't sign anything without understanding what's going on." The lawyer, apparently used to this kind of situation, just nodded and took the papers back. "I will pass on your message, sir. She needs to be notified of your decision." Felipe, already irritated by the situation, sighed. "Do it as quickly as possible, but tell her that I won't make any decisions without talking to her first." The lawyer left, and as Felipe remained silent, a wave of restlessness took hold of him. He felt he could wait no longer. He had to find Rose, he had to understand what she really wanted. So he asked the driver, "Follow that lawyer. I don't know where she is, but she must be somewhere. I want you to find out where she is and let me know." The driver, always professional, waved and drove off. Felipe remained in his office, his thoughts in disarray, until the driver returned later with the information. "Sir, I found her. She's working as a waitress in a bar on the other side of town," the driver informed in a serious tone. Felipe felt a wave of disbelief. Rose, his wife, was working in a bar. He couldn't believe it. It seemed surreal. He didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear: he couldn't leave her in that situation. "Where exactly?" he asked, already decided to go there. Felipe walked into the bar and his eyes quickly fixed on Rose, who was standing with his back turned, serving a nearby table. The sound of the door opening caught her attention, but it was when she looked at him that she almost dropped the tray from her hands. She turned around, visibly surprised, and her eyes met Felipe's, who was watching her with an expression that mixed surprise and something harder to identify. Rose felt her heart race, and a chill ran down her spine. "What are you doing here?" she managed to ask, trying to hide the nervousness in her voice, but her hands betrayed the tension as they clutched the tray. Felipe, without looking away, took a step towards her. The noise of the city outside seemed to grow more distant as he approached, the atmosphere suddenly heavier and charged with unspoken emotions. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his voice low but firm. Felipe looked at Rose with a mixture of pain and understanding. He was there, in front of her, and despite everything that had happened, the reality of his feelings was clear. Her answer, her confession that she loved him, was what he most feared to hear and what, in a way, he most wanted to hear at the same time. "We need to talk, Rose," Felipe said, his voice firm but softened by the urgency of resolving what seemed like a labyrinth of feelings and lies. She didn't answer right away. It took her a moment to process the intensity of the situation, but then, with a deep sigh, she looked up at him and, without saying anything else, simply nodded. They walked to the back of the bar, away from the curious gazes of the customers and the hustle and bustle of the street outside. The place was quieter, more private, but the weight of the approaching conversation seemed to make the air even thicker. Felipe turned to her, his gaze grave. "So why did you fake my brother's pregnancy?" Rose lowered her head, her shoulders hunching slightly as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. She knew she could no longer hide anything. "I think you know the answer, Felipe," she said, her voice low, full of regret and shame. Felipe frowned, taking a step closer to her, trying to comprehend everything she was saying. "Was it for money, Rose?" She let out a heavy sigh, finally looking up at him. "Yes. It was." The words came out as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I couldn't stand all this poverty anymore. I spoke up, your brother believed me, and we decided to get married. But he died. I was going to disappear. But you showed up, wanting to get married. I accepted." She hesitated, feeling a deep pain in her chest as she remembered everything she had done. Felipe watched her, trying to process her words. Silence hung between them, heavy and dense. "And what did you intend to do, Rose?" he asked, his voice softer but still full of confusion. She looked at him, her eyes watering. "I don't know, Felipe. She paused, pain consuming her. "But now there's no way out. I filed for divorce. I don't want to mess up your life anymore." Felipe took a step back, as if her words had hit him like a punch. He knew the decision was beyond his control, but the anguish still overwhelmed him. "You know you won't get anything, don't you?" he asked, his expression serious, trying to keep his distance. She nodded, her head down. "Yes, I know." His voice was almost inaudible. "I don't want anyone's money anymore. I'm going to live off my work. I don't want to lie anymore." Felipe looked at her with a look full of conflicting emotions. Then, his next question, softer, came out almost as a whisper. "Did you ever like me, Rose?" She didn't have an immediate response, just remained silent, reflecting on everything that had happened between them. After a few seconds, she finally looked into his eyes, with sincerity and a slight visible pain. "I love you, Felipe," she said, the words coming out almost like a sigh. "But I know there's no way you can want me anymore." Felipe felt like the world was about to collapse, but he didn't hesitate. His heart already knew the answer before his mind even had time to process it. "I love you, Rose," he said, his eyes fixed intently on hers, as if there were no doubt left. I can't live without you. I can forget all this, if you want me to." Rose, completely taken by Felipe's words, stood still, not knowing how to react. She felt a mixture of pain, surprise and something else that she couldn't identify. It was as if everything she expected and feared was coming together in that moment. Suddenly, without another word, she ran to him, her steps quick and desperate, and hugged him with all the strength she had. Tears began to fall from her eyes, her emotions overflowing uncontrollably. Felipe wrapped her in his arms, feeling her body against his, and their lips met in an intense kiss, full of all the pain, regret and unresolved desire. It was a kiss that needed no words, just surrender. They both lost themselves in the moment, as if the world around them had disappeared, and all that remained was the need to be together, overcoming the past and, perhaps, building a new beginning. When they broke apart, still breathing heavily, Rose looked up at him, her eyes still watery, but now filled with a hope she hadn't known she could have. She didn't need lies anymore, and he accepted her, despite everything. They were together, and that was all that mattered. Felipe smiled, his expression soft, and with a touch of her hair, he spoke, his voice low but firm, "I will love you, Rose, and together we will leave the past behind. No matter what happens, we can start over." Rose, her heart pounding in her chest, felt that finally, after so much time of pain and confusion, she had found peace. They had a chance. And together, they were going to do whatever it took to be happy. And at that moment, under the soft light of the morning that was beginning to break, they both knew that the path would be difficult, but they were willing to face it together, without any more lies, only with love and the truth.